Happy Monday. I have to first apologize for posting this so late. The weekend just got away from me, and this is the first chance I had at school to do this, so I do apologize. This week, you're going to participate in a discussion, so again, you have to comment on someone else's post, and you have to do that by Thursday. The original comment or post should be done by Tuesday at 11:55 a.m. You also have a quiz on Friday that has to be done by 11:55 a.m., but of course all of that could be done ahead of time. Also want to remind you again about that paper outline that's coming up. The paper topic is your choice. I don't assign those, but it has to do with either who you want to make a case for as the most important person or event in church history, and you can't do Jesus or the crucifixion or something like that. As far as the reading that you're going to do this week, you're going to read about two really important leaders in the church. The first one deals with Constantine, who became the emperor of the Roman Empire in about 313 AD, and he made Christianity the official religion of the empire. Constantine, we think, kind of had the attitude of, if you can't beat him, join him. And so, there were other emperors right before him who tried to kind of overpower the Christians. And by the time Constantine became the emperor, it became clear that that was kind of a hard thing to do, because every time a different emperor persecuted the Christians, that really only led to more attention and more people being intrigued by this new religion. And so he made it the official religion, which of course was both a good and a bad thing for Christianity. Of course it was great that the persecutions ended. Of course it was great that people could publicly practice their faith. But it also meant that there were people who were converting now for more political reasons, or because there were some perks to being part of the official religion of the empire. And so people probably didn't have as vehement of a faith. Also, Constantine himself was sort of a controversial leader, because we're really unclear about his own religious beliefs. He was the leader of the church. He made himself the leader of the church, and yet he wasn't baptized himself until he was on his deathbed. And so it's really hard to determine how sincere he was about his own beliefs, but he did try to manage the church. And this was called Caesaropapism, when the emperor kind of put themselves in charge of the church. We see this, you'll see this as you read about the different eras in history, that this happened several times. And of course, when you combine church and state, that can be really troublesome. Today, when we see it in our society, sometimes we see the negative effects of how, church and state affects religion, and like people wanting to tear down statues and take God off money and things like that. But in general, the separation of church and state is a really good thing, because you don't have a government trying to run your church. And this did happen with Constantine, and he did call some of the first church councils. So you're going to read about 4 different church councils: Nicaea, Constantinople, Ephesus, and Chalcedon. And these were called by emperors. They were good in that they articulated church doctrine and started to hone in on what it really meant to be Christian. They were, I don't want to say bad, but they were kind of negative in that it led to a lot of warring and fighting. And I do mean like actual wars and people being killed over some of the things that they discussed at these councils. Essentially, what they were trying to determine was the nature of the Trinity. And even that idea of Trinity, Father, Son, Holy Spirit, 3 persons in one God, that was, in its like rough draft form, and people didn't fully understand what that meant either. So the Council of Nicaea was the first of these councils, and there they drafted what's called the Nicene Creed. However, our current idea of the Nicene Creed really was a more edited version that happened at the church councils after Nicaea. And so they had to keep adding things to the creed, and that was in response to a bunch of different heresies. I talked about that last week, but the big one this week is the Arian heresy. So you're going to read about Arius, their leader, and their kind of teachings about the nature of Jesus in particular. And of course, there was argument, debate, and fighting over the Holy Spirit, and even the Virgin Mary, and how they're all connected and what their nature was. Are they human? Are they divine? Are they both? Are they half of each? Is God more divine than Jesus? Is Jesus like a demigod? You know, those were kind of some of the early debates, which of course to us today seems like basic knowledge and very nitpicky, but at the time they were really fighting this out. Like, what do we believe about Jesus and God and the Holy Spirit and Mary, and how are they all connected? And the wording, although very nuanced and nitpicky, was very important to the different groups. So also, chapter 8 will go over some of the early church leadership positions, like the role of the bishop, and then the Patriarch of Constantinople versus the Pope. The Pope, of course, today is seen as the head of the church, but in the early church, when the empire was divided into two parts, the Eastern and Western, they had kind of a leader in both parts. One was the Pope, who got the name from papas, or father, and the other was the Patriarch of Constantinople. And for a while they were seen as equal, and then eventually the Pope was above the Patriarch. And of course the people in the East weren't very happy about that. And you'll see kind of their unhappiness build over the next couple weeks. Also, there's some information about the different styles of churches, the architecture, and how that kind of evolved, which is somewhat interesting. A lot of it's based on Roman culture, but you'll see some evolution of the buildings themselves. The next chapter is all about St. Augustine. And as I talked about Constantine, you can probably guess that he was kind of good and bad for Christianity. I think Augustine, on the other hand, was really, really good for Christianity. So a little bit about St. Augustine. You'll read a little of this. This is just a real quick summary. But he was kind of a lost soul. His mother in particular really felt a lot of agony over his lack of direction and not feeling connected with the church. His mother's name was Monica, by the way, and she really, really prayed for his conversion and really kind of nagged at him about that. For a while, he was part of a Gnostic group called the Manichaeans, and they really believed that there was kind of two gods, and one was good and one was evil, and they were always fighting each other. But again, Monica kept praying that Augustine would convert. And one day, Augustine was in this park, and he heard children playing, and they were chanting, "Take and read, take and read." And he took this to mean that he should read the Bible. So he opened the Bible to a random page and found a very inspirational passage, which led him to continue reading the Bible. So I think at that point he decided to give himself some time, like a year, to attend Mass and give Christianity kind of a trial run and see what he felt about it. So he attended Mass where St. Ambrose was the bishop and where he was the pastor. And Ambrose was a really eloquent speaker, and so we kind of credit St. Monica, his mother, reading the Bible and the homilies of Ambrose as what finally converted him. And he finally did convert. Now, before this, he had lived with a woman who he wasn't married to. They had children. And then when he converted, he kind of denounced that old life. And he wrote all about this in a famous piece of writing called the Confessions. And in the Confessions, he really does confess all the sins of his youth and really does kind of take on this more ascetic lifestyle. I'll talk more about asceticism in a minute, but he did convert. He became priest and bishop in Hippo, and he went on to be this great priest and bishop. He did argue with two different heretical groups. One were called the Donatists, the other were the Pelagians. Basically, the Donatists were very critical of people who during the persecutions denounced their faith, and then after the persecutions wanted back in the church. But in particular, they were critical of priests who did that. And so they were saying that if you received a sacrament from one of these priests who had lapsed in their faith during the persecutions and now was back a member of the church, that your sacrament was invalid. And Augustine argued with them, and he basically said, the sinfulness of the minister or the priest doesn't matter, that Jesus is working through them, and that it's really Jesus who's administering the grace in the sacraments. The Pelagians, on the other hand, were people who believed that we really didn't need this grace that Augustine talked about to get into heaven, and that we could get into heaven on our own, with our faith alone. And so he disagreed with them also and said we need God's grace in order to get to heaven, and we can't get there on our own. I'm backtracking a little bit, but there was also at this time a rise in monasticism. So there was this saint, He wasn't a saint at the time, but his name was Anthony of Egypt. He was a hermit. He lived out in the desert. He had a very strict lifestyle that included a lot of prayer. And so people kind of observed his lifestyle and then modeled themselves after him. So you had suddenly, in the chaos of society where they were constantly under attack by barbarians, these Christians who were going out into the desert, and they were kind of living alone in caves, but they lived near each other. And so they would celebrate Eucharist together. And eventually, a person kind of put a wall around those little caves, and they became a community living together. And this was the beginning of monasteries or monasticism. And a monastic lifestyle was an ascetic lifestyle. Asceticism is like a very extreme version of self-denial, where you would deny yourself sleep and food, and you might even harm yourself so that you deny yourself pleasure. And so asceticism was kind of hand in hand with monasticism. And there was a long time that monasteries were kind of the way that people lived religious life, and they devoted themselves to study and prayer. But they also, a fault of monasticism was that they were so entranced in the monasteries and not leaving the monasteries that they lost touch with the suffering of the people outside and ministering to the poor and the sick. And so there were problems with monasticism, but that also is a big thing at this time. So good luck with the quiz this week. Good luck with the discussion, and I will talk to you again next week.